Hey everyone, it's Joe Crawl, President of the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. I hope you've been liking these weekly video sessions of ours, and if you do, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Just click subscribe down below, and again, always give us a big thumbs up, and do not hesitate to share this video with your friends, your other pro-life friends that are out there. Again, I always advocate the more a pro-life advocate knows, the more powerful their argument becomes. And I think that's something that we would all agree with. Knowledge is power, and it means something. And speaking of knowledge, this really kind of gets into our topic of the week, and that is informed consent legislation. What it is, what's the history of it, and so forth. And so let's just go ahead and dive into this real quick. Informed consent, typically when we talk about informed consent standards, and normally when we think of informed consent, we think of like surgical procedures, medical procedures that are going to happen. Doctor gives you all the information that you need in order to make a fully informed decision regarding the procedure, such as risks, what are the percentage rates of success, what other alternative means may be available, all sorts of stuff is given usually by a doctor to a patient when it comes to fully informing them so they can make a properly informed decision. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the history of informed consent and abortion, we see something quite different. When obviously Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton became law of the land, much of the informed consent that was given to women was something that was rushed, short, quick, and in many ways it kept women in the dark. So for example, women would go in, they would fill out a form, and typically those forms were highly technical in medical language, and so many of the women had no clue what they were dealing with when it came to the abortion procedure. And that obviously posed a problem. They certainly weren't informed about fetal development. They certainly weren't informed about alternatives available to them, such as adoption or even public assistance. And on top of it, this form was basically rushed. This was all designed in many ways to keep women in the dark. And as a result, we begin to recognize this as a pro-life movement. And then we begin to see the rise of informed consent legislation. I want to focus on Pennsylvania here real quick, because in many ways they kind of were the trailblazer, if you will, when it came to informed consent legislation. In the late 80s, we have them pass an informed consent bill along with other bills. And what happens is these laws are challenged by Planned Parenthood. And it eventually makes its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, interestingly enough, does decide that the state does have an interest in passing such regulations and so forth. And interestingly enough, this is in the infamous Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision, where the mystery of the universe passages is so frequently talked about. But even as bad as that decision was in some ways, it did allow for states to pass informed consent legislation. And I think that's a powerful and important point when we talk about that. This particular legislation allowed for alternatives to be given to the women. It put the associated risks in kind of plain language for the women. It certainly gave them alternatives that were available, such as adoption and so forth. And it gave them fetal development pictures. In many ways, this was a time before the ultrasound. So the way to look inside the womb, if you will, was to look at fetal developmental pictures. And so this was, in most states, you either do it in like 2 or 3 week increments in some cases to show the development of the unborn child. And on top of it, it had a waiting period as well. Because, again, most normal medical practices, they give you the information and then they don't rush you off into surgery. They usually give you the information and you have time to sit, think about it, make a fully informed decision, even do research on your own if need be, and come back and have the surgery at a later date. And so this law, this Pennsylvania law, in many ways mandated a waiting period as well. And so all this was upheld. And so it's very important to note that with respect to really Pennsylvania being the trailblazer and setting the model, if you will, for informed consent legislation. Now, let's take a step back here and let's talk about what informed consent is and the principle of informed consent. Typically, this sort of principle, this moral principle, if you will, is something that's normally used when it comes to medical procedures. So, as I've been saying, typically doctors will inform a patient of everything he needs to know in order to make a fully informed decision regarding a medical procedure. It's just a way to help, if you will, number one, to help the intellect know a little bit more about the crisis at hand, if you will, and what the remedy could be. But two, it also helps inform the conscience. And that's something that we really need to explore a little bit here as well, because when we talk about the conscience, when we look at it from at least a classical sort of way, the conscience is defined as that intellectual judgment about the moral quality of the rightness or wrongness of a particular act. So we could talk about, the rightness or wrongness. Is this surgery right for me? I mean, do I have enough, is the risk too great for me to go under the knife, if you will? Or, is this too expensive? Can I afford it even? These are typical questions that patients will ask themselves. And so forming our conscience is something that is definitely needed. And this type of legislation, informed consent legislation, also known as women's right to know legislation, certainly provides that opportunity for the women to get all this information regarding risks, regarding alternatives, regarding fetal development, and she can literally have the time to digest it and get to know it. And hopefully her conscience will react in the right way. That is certainly the goal of the legislation. But let me be clear here too, because one of the main things about this legislation, and an intriguing part of this legislation, is that it's not only about informing the woman about the scientific facts, about alternatives that are available, whether that be through adoption agencies, crisis pregnancy centers, public assistance, or what have you, or even fetal development. Part of it is about humanizing the unborn. Her taking in this information, especially with fetal development, scientifically accurate fetal development information. When she receives that, the whole blob of tissue myth that the abortion industry has perpetrated is blown out of the water. The simple fact is you can't keep women in the dark when they're given this information about the truth, that this child is not just a mere blob of tissue, that it's an organized organism that is developing and growing. And, soon will, at certain points has a heartbeat, has detectable brain waves, will grow fingernails, toenails, and so forth, and is functioning as a fully organized human being as well. So in many ways, this helps humanize it. Now, one of the interesting things about women's right to know legislation is that over the years, in many ways, many states that have passed it have kind of amended it. So for example, with ultrasound laws. And I think this is important to further this idea of humanizing the unborn. When we're talking 20, 30 years ago, the ultrasound technology just wasn't widely available, if available at all. And the simple fact that it is widely available today and that women need to be shown the ultrasound only further humanizes the unborn child. She knows at this point when she sees her unborn child that this is indeed a human being. Now, the goal of all this type of legislation, as I said, is to help her realize the humanity of the unborn child. And I think that's an important sort of point here. Because in many ways, like I was saying just a few moments ago, it helps destroy the various myths that the abortion industry has perpetrated about the unborn child. That it's a mere blob of tissue. There was one famous video that came out recently, like the magic birth canal and whatnot. We need to fundamentally recognize that the unborn child is indeed human, even at its earliest stages, that it's a fully functioning member of the species Homo sapiens. And this is an important sort of fact that we ultimately, all of us, need to realize even more. But it's very important when we see women who are in desperate need of information that we make sure that they get this information. That's one of the big things that we certainly see for sidewalk counselors, and them passing out information regarding fetal development alternatives and so forth. And I think in many ways this legislation helps push us, if you will, towards a culture of life by the mere fact that it helps better inform the pregnant mother about the humanity of her unborn child. And it certainly lets the abortion industry know that you can't get away with telling lies. That is wrong. That is an evil. You can't keep women in the dark. You just can't hand them a form and then 5 minutes later try to shove them off to get an abortion. That is a wrong. In many ways, this legislation is completely reasonable insofar as it's informing the women. It's giving them time to digest the necessary information. And 3, finally, helps them to realize the humanity of their own unborn child that is developing within them. Well, again, guys, I hope you liked this short video. Again, if you enjoyed Pro-Life University, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Give us a big thumbs up. And, as always, if you can share, please do. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. God bless.